What breaks a soldier after the war is no longer the sound of gunfire, but the silence that follows. How many battles are still fought after the uniform is folded away? And what could a child ever know about a war he never saw? A gust of late spring wind moved the faded American flags staked along the edge of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Tourists drifted past, voices low, heads tilted, their expressions a mixture of reverence and distance, sympathy without truly knowing. But one man stood still among the shifting crowds, eyes locked on a single name etched into the black granite wall. His fingers hovered inches away, trembling, not out of age, but memory. Walter Walt Decker, 74, veteran of the 1st Cavalry Division, had made this trip every year on the same day, May 19th, the day Clifford M. Hayes died in his arms, 40 miles west of Pleiku. Walt whispered those coordinates in his sleep, even now, even 53 years later. His frame was still upright, solid beneath the threadbare navy blue windbreaker he always wore, the one with the stitched-on 1st Cav patch that had faded into blurred gold and black. A Korean War veteran had once offered to update it, embroider a fresh patch. Walt declined. Some colors aren't meant to shine anymore. He pressed a palm against the cool stone, his breath catching, unshed tears filling the corners of his tired blue eyes. "You held on just long enough to ruin me, Cliff," Walt murmured. His voice cracked, the kind of sound that slips free when no one's supposed to hear it. But words like that, said aloud after decades, needed room to fall. And no one listens better than a memorial wall. His wife passed 8 winters ago, pneumonia, quietly in the middle of the night beside him. She had been one of the few people who knew how to make Walt laugh after a nightmare. These days, the early mornings came stiff and hollow. He made instant coffee in a chipped mug that read, "Best Grandpa Ever," with the G faded almost completely off. He never had kids. The mug was a gift from his neighbor's grandchild because Walt once fixed her bike chain. He read the paper by the window of his small Arlington apartment, glancing at headlines he barely absorbed. Most days, the only company he kept was a shortwave radio and a scar above his right knee, where a mortar shell found him in 1969. In moments of solitude, which were many, Walt would run a finger along the edge of his Purple Heart, kept in a cigar box under the bed alongside letters from men long buried. He tried volunteering at the VA, but hearing younger veterans talk about their tours brought flashbacks that were less like memories and more like ambushes. So he stopped going. Too loud, he told them simply. Not meaning the volume of their voices, of course, but no one asked further. Life became a loop. Wake, stare, sleep, repeat. Except for May 19th. That morning he took bus 38B from Columbia Pike, wearing the same windbreaker, clean jeans, boots he polished until the leather cracked. He brought no flowers, just a folded piece of lined paper he had written on over and over throughout the years, only to crumple and rewrite. It was a letter he could never finish, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he still didn't know how to forgive himself. At exactly 9:26 a.m., Walt arrived at the wall. The sky was overcast, restless clouds stirring above the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. His boots crunched lightly on the gravel as he made his way past panel 28E, stopping in front of line 72. That was where Clifford M. Hayes lived, forever 23, 12 days from finishing his tour. He had a southern accent thick as molasses, a laugh that popped every so often out of nowhere, and a habit of twirling his dog tags when he thought too hard about home. Walt stared until the name blurred, lips faintly parted. Nearby, a few tourists lingered. A teenagers' school group passed by, their murmurs floating like leaves on water. No one bothered the man in the windbreaker, until a pair of tiny footsteps crunched softly behind him. "Excuse me, Mister?" Walt turned slowly. She couldn't have been older than 8. Freckles scattered across her cheeks like cinnamon dusting. Hair the color of wheat at harvest, pulled into a ponytail that was already halfway undone. She was dressed in a white cotton dress with embroidered yellow daisies hugging the hem. In her small hands, she clutched a velvet box that looked too delicate to belong in such determined fingers. "Are you a soldier?" Walt hesitated. "Used to be." His voice rasped like tired gravel. The girl looked at him closely, like she could see straight into him. You know my dad? Walt blinked. I don't know, he answered carefully. Who was your dad? She opened the box with the reverence of someone unfolding history. Inside, cushioned in red satin, lay a silver star. Below it, a laminated photo of a young man in desert camouflage, laughing under sunglasses, smiling between two brothers in arms. Sergeant James Holloway, she said softly. My mum said he was real brave. But he never got to wear this. Walt took the photo cautiously, his heart squeezing suddenly, painfully. He remembered that name, but not from Vietnam. Kandahar, 2003. He'd read it during an event at the VFW post years ago. A fallen Marine whose body was found shielding two wounded soldiers during an ambush. There'd been a write-up in Stars and Stripes. Walt had clipped it. There was something tragically familiar about the look in Holloway's eyes. That absolute clarity a man got when he'd made peace with dying. They gave it to her months later, said a woman's voice gently behind the child. But Lily said she didn't want to keep it in a drawer where no one could see it. The mother stepped forward, her hands carefully folded, her eyes red but smiling softly. She said heroes should be with heroes. Lily held the medal out toward him. Can you give this to someone here, someone who didn't get theirs? She bit her lower lip. My dad won't mind. And in that instant, something inside Walt cracked, not like bones but like ice at the end of winter. He took the box with both trembling hands, eyes shimmering, not with sorrow, but with something older, rarer, a recognition, a relinquishing. He looked down at Lily, then up at the endless etchings on the wall. They were watching still. And maybe there was still a duty left in him after all. Walt stood frozen, the velvet box in his hands feeling heavier than any rifle he'd ever carried. The silver star inside gleamed under the muted sunlight, a tiny shard of honor that didn't belong to him, yet somehow burned against his weathered palms. Lily's small, hopeful face stared up at him, her eyes wide with a trust he hadn't seen in decades. It was the kind of trust that could shatter a man who'd spent half a century building walls around his guilt. His throat tightened, a lump forming that no amount of swallowing could dislodge. He wanted to hand the box back, to tell her she'd picked the wrong soldier, that he wasn't the hero she thought he was. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, his gaze drifted to the black granite wall, to Clifford M. Hayes's name, etched there like an accusation he could never outrun. I don't know if I'm the right person for this, kid, Walt finally rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at Lily, then at her mother, whose gentle smile faltered just enough to show she understood more than she let on. This medal, it's your dad's. It's yours. I can't just... But you're a hero too, aren't you? Lily interrupted, her voice small but insistent, cutting through his protest like a blade through fog. Mom says heroes take care of each other, even when they're gone. Walt's breath hitched. He felt the weight of every year since Pleiku pressing down on him, every sleepless night, every unspoken apology. Heroes take care of each other. The words echoed, sharp and cruel, because he hadn't taken care of Cliff. He'd held him as the life drained out of him, as the jungle swallowed their screams, but he hadn't saved him. He'd promised Cliff he'd write to his family, tell them how brave he'd been, how he'd smiled even at the end. But Walt never sent that letter. The draft sat unfinished in that cigar box under his bed, next to the Purple Heart he didn't feel he deserved. Guilt had silenced him then, and it silenced him now. He looked away, his jaw tightening, his eyes stinging with tears he refused to let fall. The reflecting pool stretched out in the distance, a mirror to the sky's grey unrest, and beyond it, the Lincoln Memorial loomed, stoic, unyielding, a monument to a man who'd carried burdens Walt could only imagine. But Walt's burdens weren't carved in marble. They were carved into his bones, into the way his hands shook when he held something as pure as a child's faith. Lily, honey, maybe we should let the gentleman think about it, her mother said softly, stepping closer. Her voice was kind, but there was a weight in it, a shared understanding of loss that made Walt's chest ache. She placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, but the girl didn't budge, her eyes still fixed on Walt, waiting for something he didn't know how to give. I don't want Dad's medal to be lonely, Lily murmured almost to herself. He's not here, but Maybe someone else is. Someone who needs it more. Walt's knees felt weak, and for a moment he thought he might sink to the ground right there, in front of the wall, in front of this child who carried a grief she couldn't fully grasp. He wanted to tell her that medals didn't fix anything, that they didn't bring back the dead or erase the things you'd seen, the things you'd done or failed to do. But how could he say that to her? How could he shatter the hope in her eyes when he'd already shattered so much in his own life? He forced himself to straighten, gripping the box tighter, as if holding onto it could anchor him against the storm inside. I'll think on it, he managed, his voice rough, barely holding together. I promise. Lily nodded, a small, satisfied smile tugging at her lips, as if she'd already decided he'd do the right thing. Her mother offered a grateful look, then guided Lily a few steps away, giving Walt space to breathe. But there was no breathing, not really. Not when every inhale felt like dragging in shards of glass. He turned back to the wall, to Cliff's name, and the memories came unbidden, as they always did. The heat of the jungle, the metallic tang of blood, the way Cliff's hand had gripped his arm with fading strength. Tell him I did good, Walt, he'd gasped, his voice barely a thread. Tell him I wasn't scared. Walt had nodded, lied through his teeth that everything would be okay, even as he felt the life slip away under his hands. He'd carried that lie for 53 years, along with the truth he couldn't face. That he'd been scared, more scared than he'd ever been, and that fear had kept him from writing that letter, from giving Cliff's family the closure they deserved. His fingers brushed the granite, cold and unyielding, and he whispered, I'm sorry, Cliff, I should have done better by you. The words felt hollow, too late, but they spilled out anyway, a confession to a ghost who couldn't hear him. Or maybe Cliff could. Maybe that's why Walt kept coming back year after year, hoping for absolution that never came. The crowd around the memorial shifted, voices murmuring, footsteps crunching on the gravel path. A young man in a hoodie approached, holding a phone, filming the wall as if it were just another tourist stop. Walt's jaw clenched. He wanted to snap at him, to tell him to show some respect, but he didn't have the energy. Instead, he clutched the velvet box tighter and started walking, his boots heavy against the ground, each step a battle of its own. He didn't know where he was going at first, just that he couldn't stay still. The reflecting pool came into view again, its surface rippling under the breeze, reflecting the overcast sky and the weight of history around it. He stopped at its edge, staring into the water, seeing not just his reflection but the man he used to be. Younger, stronger, braver, until the day he wasn't. The day he lost Cliff. The day he lost himself. A memory surfaced, sharp and vivid, of the last time he'd seen Cliff alive before the ambush. They'd been sitting on a crate, sharing a cigarette, Cliff twirling his dog tags like always, talking about home. When I get back, I'm going to marry Jenny, he'd said, grinning. Got the ring picked out and everything. You got to come to the wedding, Walt, be my best man. Walt had laughed, promised he'd be there, even though part of him knew neither of them might make it back. And they didn't. Not together. He shook his head, trying to push the memory down, but it clung to him, a weight that refused to lift. The velvet box in his hands felt like a grenade, one wrong move away from exploding. What was he supposed to do with it? Give it to someone at the wall like Lily asked, but who? Who deserved it more than her father, a man who died shielding others, a true hero? Walt wasn't that. He'd survived, sure, but survival wasn't heroism. Survival was just luck, and sometimes it felt like a curse. He sat on a nearby bench, the wood cold beneath him, and opened the box again. The silver star stared back, pristine, untouched by the years, unlike his own medals tarnished by time and regret. He traced the edge of the photo of Sergeant James Holloway, seeing in his eyes the same clarity Cliff had at the end. A man who knew what he was doing, who chose sacrifice over self. Walt envied that certainty. He'd never had it, not then, not now. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up to see Lily's mother standing a few feet away, Lily holding her hand, both watching him with quiet patience. I'm sorry if we've put you in a tough spot, the woman said, her voice soft but steady. Lily's been talking about this for weeks, ever since she learned what the medal meant. She's trying to understand her dad, I think, in her own way. Walt nodded slowly, his throat tight. I get it. More than you know. He paused, then added, "I lost someone too, a long time ago. Never really figured out how to make peace with it." Her eyes softened, a flicker of shared pain passing between them. Does it get easier, the missing them? He wanted to lie, to tell her it did, but he couldn't. Not to her. "No," he admitted, his voice raw, "but you learn to carry it. Some days it's lighter, others, not so much." She nodded as if she'd expected that answer, and glanced down at Lily, who was now tracing patterns in the gravel with the toe of her shoe. "She thinks you're going to find the right person for that medal. I told her it might not work that way, but she's stubborn like her dad." Walt managed a faint, broken smile, the first in what felt like years. Stubborn's not a bad thing. Keeps you going when nothing else does. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their separate griefs hanging between them, heavy but not crushing. Not yet. Walt's gaze drifted back to the reflecting pool, to the Lincoln Memorial beyond, its columns standing like sentinels over a city built on sacrifice. He wondered if Lincoln had ever felt this lost, this unworthy of the burdens placed on him. Probably. Great men always did. His thoughts were interrupted by a rustling in his jacket pocket. He reached in, pulling out the folded piece of lined paper he'd brought with him, the unfinished letter to Cliff's family. He'd rewritten it so many times, each draft more inadequate than the last. But holding it now, with Lily's medal in his other hand, something shifted inside him, a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for decades. He unfolded the paper, his hands trembling, and read the first few lines to himself. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for not writing sooner. I was with Cliff when he passed. He was brave, braver than I'll ever be. He wanted you to know he wasn't scared. I'm sorry I couldn't save him." The words blurred as his vision swam, but he kept reading silently, until he reached the part where he always stopped, the part where he tried to explain why he'd survived when Cliff hadn't. He never could find the words for that. "You've been carrying that a long time, haven't you?" Lily's mother said quietly, noticing the paper. She didn't pry, didn't ask to see it, just stood there, offering a presence he hadn't realized he needed. "Yeah," Walt muttered, folding the letter again, his fingers lingering on the creases. "Too long. Maybe it's time to let it go," she suggested, her tone gentle, not pushing, just planting the seed. Or at least, share it with someone who might understand. He didn't respond, not right away. Instead, he looked at Lily, who had wandered a few steps closer to the reflecting pool, crouching to watch a leaf float on the water's surface. Her innocence, her hope, it was a mirror to everything he'd lost, everything he'd buried. And yet it was also a reminder of why men like Cliff, like James Holloway, had fought in the first place. For kids like her. For a future they'd never see. Walt's grip on the velvet box tightened, and for the first time in years he felt the stirrings of a decision forming, raw and unpolished, but undeniable. He couldn't keep running from the past, couldn't keep hiding behind silence. Cliff deserved better. Lily deserved better. Maybe even he did. He stood, his knees protesting, and slipped the letter back into his pocket. "I need to do something," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice was steadier now, though the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. "Not yet. I don't know if it's the right thing, but I gotta try." Lily's mother tilted her head, curious but not pressing. "What are you thinking?" Walt looked at the wall in the distance, at the thousands of names carved into its surface, each one a story, a loss, a debt unpaid. Then he looked at the medal in his hands, a symbol of courage he'd never felt worthy of, but maybe someone else was. "There's a place I need to go, someone I need to find. If you and Lily can wait, I'd like you to come with me." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded, a flicker of trust mirroring her daughter's. "We'll wait. As long as you need." Lily turned, sensing the shift, and ran back to them, her ponytail bouncing. "Are you going to help, Mr. Walt?" He swallowed hard, the sound of his name in her voice cutting deeper than he expected. "I'm going to try, kid. I'm going to try." As they started walking, Walt felt the weight of the decision settle over him, heavy but necessary. He didn't know if he could make things right, didn't know if he could honor Cliff or James Holloway the way they deserved. But for the first time in decades, He felt something like purpose stirring in the hollow spaces of his soul. And as they passed the Lincoln Memorial, its shadow stretching long and solemn over the ground, Walt made a silent vow to Cliff, to Lily, to himself, that he wouldn't stop until he'd found a way to lay at least one ghost to rest. By the way, if you're feeling the weight of this story as much as I am, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're diving even deeper in the next part, and you won't want to miss how this unfolds. He glanced at the velvet box one last time before slipping it into his jacket, right next to the unfinished letter. The two pieces of his past, one old and one new, pressed against his chest like a heartbeat he'd forgotten he had. Ahead, the path stretched toward the city, toward answers he wasn't sure he was ready for. But he kept walking, Lily's small hand occasionally brushing against his as they moved, a reminder that some burdens weren't meant to be carried alone. The wind picked up, carrying the faint rustle of flags and the distant hum of Washington, D.C.'s heartbeat. Walt's steps grew firmer, though his heart still trembled. He thought of Cliff's last words, of James Holloway's sacrifice, of the countless others whose names lived on that wall. And he thought of the letter, the one he'd never finished, the one he'd never sent. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still time to say what needed to be said, to do what needed to be done. But first, he had to face the past head-on, in a way he'd avoided for 53 years. He had to find Cliff's family, or what was left of them. He had to deliver that letter, or at least try, and with it, maybe deliver himself from the silence that had haunted him since Pleiku. And as for Lily's medal, he didn't know yet, but he knew it couldn't stay with him. It had to go to someone who'd earned it, someone whose story wasn't finished, someone who still had a chance to live up to its weight. The decision burned in him, a quiet fire as they moved away from the memorial, toward a future he couldn't predict. But for the first time in a long time, Walt wasn't just surviving. He was fighting, for Cliff, for Lily, for a piece of himself he thought he'd lost forever. And though the road ahead was uncertain, though the guilt still clawed at him, he knew he couldn't turn back now. Not after all this. Not after seeing hope in a child's eyes, a hope he hadn't felt since before the war stole everything. So he walked on, the weight of 2 wars in his hands, the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial at his back, and a promise in his heart that he'd see this through, or break trying. Walt's boots felt heavier with each step as he led Lily and her mother, Sarah, through the winding streets of Arlington, the weight of the velvet box in his jacket pocket pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The city hummed around them, a distant chorus of car horns and murmured conversations, but inside Walt, a storm raged. He'd made the decision to find Cliff's family, to finally deliver the letter he'd carried for over 50 years. But now that the path was set, doubt gnawed at him like shrapnel under the skin. What if they hated him for waiting so long? What if they'd moved on, buried their grief in a way he never could, and his showing up only tore open old wounds? The thought made his stomach churn, his hands clenching into fists as they walked toward the bus stop that would take them closer to a past he wasn't sure he could face. Lily skipped a few steps ahead, her yellow daisies on her dress catching the late afternoon light, her innocence a stark contrast to the turmoil in Walt's chest. Sarah walked beside him, her presence quiet but steady, her own loss etched into the fine lines around her eyes. She hadn't asked many questions when he'd explained his plan to track down Cliff's family, just nodded with a kind of understanding that came from knowing what it meant to carry ghosts. But now, as the bus approached with a hiss of brakes, her voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," she said softly, her words almost lost in the noise of the street. "If it's too much, we can help. Or just be there." Walt's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the bus doors as they creaked open. "I've been alone with this for too long," he muttered, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. "If I don't do it now, I never will. And I owe him that much. More than that." Sarah didn't push, just gave a small nod, her hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder as they boarded. The bus smelled of diesel and worn vinyl, the seats scratched and faded, much like Walt felt inside. He sat by the window, the velvet box and the letter burning a hole in his pocket, his mind racing with every possible outcome. He'd looked up Cliff's family years ago, out of a fleeting moment of courage, only to lose his nerve when he found an address in a small Virginia town not far from Arlington. Now, that address was scrawled on a scrap of paper in his wallet, a destination that felt more like a battlefield than a home. Lily sat across from him, her legs swinging as she looked out the window, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "Are we going to see another hero, Mr. Walt?" she asked, her voice bright with curiosity. Walt swallowed hard, the word hero cutting deeper than she could know. "Something like that," he managed, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Someone who knew a friend of mine a long time ago." Her eyes sparkled with interest, but she didn't press further, turning back to the passing blur of buildings and trees. Walt envied her ability to live in the present, unburdened by the past. His own past loomed larger, with every mile the bus covered, the tension in his shoulders tightening like a coiled spring. He could feel Sarah's gaze on him occasionally, not judgmental, just watchful, as if she could sense the war waging inside him. He wanted to tell her he'd be fine, that he'd faced worse than this, but the lie wouldn't form, not when his heart pounded like it had in the jungle, waiting for an ambush. The bus ride felt endless, each stop stretching the seconds into eternities, until finally they reached the small town of Warrenton. The streets were quieter here, lined with modest houses and picket fences, a world away from the grandeur of DC's memorials, but just as heavy with history. Walt's hands trembled as he pulled the scrap of paper from his wallet, double-checking the address he'd memorized, despite himself. 214 Maple Lane. A house that might hold Cliff's sister, Ellen, the only surviving family member he'd been able to trace, if she was still there, if she even wanted to see him. They walked the last few blocks in silence, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement, the air thick with the scent of blooming lilacs and distant lawnmowers. Walt's steps slowed as they approached the house, a small weathered bungalow with a sagging porch and a garden that looked like it hadn't been tended in years. A rusted mailbox bore the name Hayes in peeling letters, and Walt's breath caught, the reality of the moment slamming into him like a mortar round. This was it. After 53 years of silence, he was standing on the edge of a reckoning he wasn't sure he could survive. Sarah touched his arm lightly, her voice low. "We'll wait here if you need us to, or come with you. Whatever you need." Walt nodded, unable to speak, his throat too tight to form words. Lily looked up at him, her small face serious now, sensing something she couldn't name. "It's okay, Mr. Walt," she said softly, her voice a tiny anchor in the storm. "Heroes are brave even when they're scared." Her words pierced him, a reminder of Cliff's last request, to tell his family he wasn't scared. Walt's eyes burned, but he blinked the tears away, forcing his legs to move toward the porch. Each step felt like wading through mud, the weight of the letter in his pocket heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. He reached the door, his hand hovering over the chipped paint, hesitating. What if Ellen wasn't there? What if she was and she turned him away? What if she looked at him and saw the failure he'd always felt himself to be? He knocked, the sound hollow, echoing in his chest. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that had haunted him since Vietnam, the kind that screamed louder than gunfire. Then the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 60s, her hair a mix of grey and faded auburn, her eyes sharp but tired, carrying a weight that mirrored Walt's own. She looked at him, confusion flickering across her face, then something deeper, something like recognition. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cautious but not unkind, a southern drawl lingering in the edges just like Cliff's had. Walt's mouth went dry, his prepared words evaporating. He fumbled for a moment, then managed, I'm Walter Decker. I knew your brother, Clifford, in Vietnam." Her expression shifted, a flash of pain crossing her features before they hardened, as if bracing for impact. "Cliff," she repeated, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "That was a long time ago." "I know," Walt said, his own voice breaking under the strain. "Too long. I should have come sooner. I was with him when it happened, and I've been carrying something I should have given you years ago." Ellen's eyes narrowed slightly, but she stepped back, gesturing for him to come inside. "You'd better sit down then," she said, her tone unreadable. Walt glanced back at Sarah and Lily, who stood at the edge of the yard waiting, their presence a silent support. He nodded to them. Then followed Ellen into a living room that smelled of old wood and lavender, the walls lined with faded photographs, one of which caught his eye, a young Cliff in his uniform, grinning with that same reckless charm Walt remembered. They sat across from each other, the air between them thick with unspoken history. Walt pulled the letter from his pocket, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "I wrote this, or tried to, right after he passed," he began, his voice raw, each word a struggle. "I wanted to tell you how brave he was, how he wasn't scared even at the end. He asked me to tell you that, but I couldn't send it. I didn't know how to say I'm sorry for not saving him, for coming back when he didn't." Ellen's face remained still, but her eyes shimmered, a storm of emotion held back by sheer will. She took the letter when he offered it, her fingers brushing the worn paper as if it were something sacred. She didn't read it, not yet, just held it, her gaze fixed on Walt. "You think I needed a letter to know he was brave?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with pain. "I knew that the day he left for basic. I knew it every day he was gone. What I needed was to know why no one told us how he went, why it took 50 years for someone to show up on my porch." Walt's chest constricted, guilt flooding him like a tidal wave. "I was a coward," he admitted, the confession tearing out of him, jagged and ugly. "I couldn't face it, couldn't face you. I thought if I didn't say it out loud it wouldn't be real. But it's been real every day since. I see him every time I close my eyes, I hear him. And I'm sorry, Ellen, I'm so damn sorry." For a long moment she said nothing, just looked at him, her expression a mix of grief and something softer, something he didn't dare name. Then, slowly, she unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the lines he'd written and rewritten, the words he'd poured his shame and sorrow into. When she finished, she set it down on the coffee table between them, her hands trembling now too. "He talked about you," she said finally, her voice quieter, almost fragile. "In his letters home, said you were the one who kept him laughing, even when things got bad. Said you'd be the one to get him through if anyone could. I don't think he blamed you, Walter. I think he trusted you. And I think he'd be glad you're here now." Walt's vision blurred, the tears he'd held back for decades finally spilling over, hot and unrelenting. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking, the weight of her words cracking something deep inside him, something he'd thought was broken beyond repair. It wasn't absolution, not fully, but it was a start, a crack in the wall he'd built around his guilt, letting in a sliver of light he hadn't felt in years. Ellen reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his, a gesture so simple, yet so heavy with meaning. "It's not your fault he's gone," she said, her voice steady now, though her own eyes were wet. "But it's your burden to carry, isn't it? Just like it's mine. We've both been carrying it too long. Maybe it's time we let some of it go." Walt nodded, unable to speak, the tears still falling, each one a release of something he'd buried since Pleiku. They sat there for a long time, two strangers bound by a shared loss, the silence between them no longer heavy but healing, a quiet understanding that words couldn't touch. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting golden streaks through the window, illuminating Cliff's photo on the wall, his grin a reminder of what they'd both lost and what they could still honor. When Walt finally stood to leave, Ellen walked him to the door, the letter still on the table behind her. "Come back sometime," she said, her tone softer now, almost hopeful. "If you want. I've got more stories about him. Things you might want to hear." "I'd like that," Walt managed, his voice hoarse but genuine. "I've got some too, if you're up for listening." She gave a small, sad smile, the first he'd seen from her, and nodded. As he stepped off the porch, Sarah and Lily approached, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Lily ran to him, her eyes wide. "Did you tell them about your friend?" she asked, her voice full of innocent urgency. "Yeah, kid," Walt said, his voice steadier now, though the emotion still lingered. "I did. Took a while, but I did." Sarah offered a gentle smile, her own relief evident. "I'm glad. For you. For them." Walt nodded, the weight in his chest lighter, though not gone. Not yet. There was still one more thing to do, one more burden to lay down. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the velvet box with the silver star, its gleam catching the fading light. Lily's eyes lit up, but Walt shook his head slightly, his decision solidifying in that moment. "I can't keep this," he said, his voice firm though not unkind. "Your dad earned it, and there's someone else who needs it more than I do. Someone who's still fighting their own war." Sarah tilted her head, understanding dawning. "What do you mean?" Walt took a deep breath, the idea forming fully now, a final act of duty he hadn't realized he was capable of until this moment. "There's a VA center not far from here. I used to go there before it got too hard. There are men and women there, younger than me, carrying things they shouldn't have to carry alone. One of them needs to know they're seen, that their fight matters. I'm going to give this to someone there, someone who's still got a chance to live up to it." Lily's face fell for a moment, but then she nodded, a small, serious nod that made her look older than her years. "Dad would like that," she said quietly. "He'd want someone to be brave with it." Walt's throat tightened again, but this time it wasn't just grief. It was gratitude, a warmth he hadn't felt in too long. "Yeah, kid. I think he would." The next morning, Walt woke before dawn, the familiar ache in his bones still there, but somehow different, less suffocating. He made his instant coffee in the chipped Best Grandpa Ever mug, the faded G a reminder of small kindnesses he'd almost forgotten. For the first time in years, he didn't just stare out the window at nothing. Instead, he pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began to write. Not a letter of apology, but a list of names, men and women from the VA he remembered, ones whose stories had stuck with him, ones who might need a symbol of courage more than he ever had. He spent the day at the VA center, the noise and memories no longer ambushes but challenges he could face, one step at a time. He spoke to a young veteran, a woman named Marissa, who'd lost her leg in Afghanistan and her hope somewhere along the way. Her eyes, hollow and distant, reminded him of his own in the years after Vietnam. When he handed her the velvet box, explaining its story, James Holloway's sacrifice, Lily's trust, his own long road to this moment, her hands shook as she took it, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, echoing Walt's own doubts. "None of us feel we do," Walt told her, his voice steady now, a strength he hadn't known he still had. "But it's not about deserving. It's about carrying on for the ones who can't. You've got more fight in you. Use it." Marissa nodded, clutching the box to her chest, a flicker of something like hope igniting in her gaze. Walt felt a piece of his own burden lift in that moment, a symbolic renunciation of the guilt he'd worn like a second skin. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring Cliff or James back, but he could pass on their courage, their sacrifice, to someone who still had battles to fight. It wasn't absolution, but it was purpose, and for Walt, that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and Walt's routine began to shift, small changes at first, then larger ones. He returned to the VA not just to drop off the medal, but to stay, to listen, to share stories of Cliff and others, finding that the ambushes of memory hurt less when spoken aloud. He visited Ellen again, their conversations awkward at first but growing easier, a bridge built over shared loss. He even fixed another bike chain for the neighbor's grandchild, the Best Grandpa Ever mug, no longer just a relic, but a reminder of connections he could still make. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Arlington, Walt stood at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial once more. Not on May 19th, but on an ordinary day, a day he chose for himself. Lily and Sarah were with him, the little girl holding a single daisy she'd picked from a nearby field. She placed it at the base of the wall near Cliff's name, her small hand steady, her face thoughtful. Walt watched, his heart a mix of ache and warmth, as she stepped back and looked up at him. "He's not lonely now, right?" she asked, her voice soft but sure. Walt knelt beside her, his knees protesting but his spirit quieter than it had been in years. "No, kid. He's not. None of them are. Not as long as we're here to remember." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they'd shared, however brief. Walt stood, his gaze lingering on Cliff's name. The black granite no longer just a wall of guilt, but a testament to lives lived, to promises kept, however late. He thought of the silver star, now in Marissa's hands, a beacon for her own healing, and of the letter finally delivered, its words no longer a weight but a bridge. As they walked away, the memorial behind them bathed in the golden glow of dusk, Walt felt the silence around him shift, not the oppressive silence of loss, but the gentle quiet of acceptance, of moving forward while still carrying the past. War had taken much from him, from so many, but time, he realized, offered something in return, the chance to heal, to reconnect, to honor those gone by living for them. It wasn't a cure, not fully, but it was a start, a re-beginning in the face of endings. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think of someone you've lost or a burden you've carried, comment below with, "I believe in healing." Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want to see more stories like Walt's, more journeys of heartbreak and hope, make sure to subscribe. We've got more to tell and we'd love to have you with us.